The ice beneath their boots shimmered like glass, the cavern stretching out around them in jagged beauty, a cathedral of frozen light, blue-white and violet woven into towering arches and needle spires 100 meters tall. The alien scientists moved with wide eyes, scanning readings and muttering through their breath filters. The temperature was dropping steadily despite the thermal anomaly that had drawn them here. The heat signatures buried deep below the surface made no sense, and now that they stood in the heart of the formation, the numbers only grew stranger. Lieutenant Riley Mace watched them quietly, her visor HUD blank. She had disabled the overlay the moment they passed the second fault line, because data was only part of the truth, and she trusted her senses more than screens. She crouched and ran a gloved hand across the icy floor, feeling the faintest tremble, not vibration, but something slower, deeper, like breath caught in a glacier. Overhead something shifted with a moan, and the echoes multiplied, strange and uneven. The lead Xenar from the Golfar Dominion clicked his mandibles and barked a warning in his native tongue. The others scattered and drew their scanners, pulsing beams of infrared and sonar through the walls. The cavern did not like that. It groaned again, louder this time, like the sigh of an old world remembering weight and pressure and collapse. Then the crack came. It was not a noise, it was a judgment. The sound of the ceiling fracturing split the air with a violence that stilled even the most panicked hearts. A sudden spike in pressure, a rush of snowdust, a screech of stone against stone, followed by a single shard of ice, the size of a transport shuttle, slamming into the ground 20 meters from their position. Screams followed, not human screams, but high chittering tones full of panic, as two of the Larthan geologists bolted in opposite directions, calling for emergency exfil, while their navigation packs spun in confused loops. The floor shuddered again, not a quake, but a pull, a downward motion so subtle Riley barely caught it, but it was real, a settling, a warning. She turned slowly, not rushing, because rushing was what got people killed in caves. She stepped forward toward the center of the chamber, boots crunching softly on the frost. Every sound she made echoed longer than it should have, the acoustics warped. Another ice spear crashed down behind the group, this time closer. The others were yelling, forming clusters, shouting readings over open comms. Riley ignored all of it. She reached into her belt, pulled out an old metal rod, and wrapped it once against the wall beside her. The echo came back, clear but long. She tapped again and turned her head. There was a difference in the sound direction depth. She could feel the way the cavern curved around her, how the ice was breathing. She knew it then. The cavern was collapsing, but not randomly. It was folding inward toward something deeper below, and if they did not find the right exit soon, they would not find one at all. Panic does not need language. It spreads faster than light, through instinct alone. And in the collapsing ice cavern beneath the frozen surface of Thraxis, it was already too late for calm. The alien scientists scattered like birds under gunfire, their training forgotten, their tech ignored as fear overwhelmed logic. They called out in fractured bursts of 5 different tongues, all overlapping, none of them listening. The Golfar tactical lead tried to issue coordinates, but his translation matrix stuttered and blinked red, unable to sync with the shifting terrain as the walls began to move around them. The ice was not just falling, it was transforming. Tunnels warped behind them, solid walls rippled and split into new chambers as the weight of the glacier above began to press and reform the cavern system below. The sensors, overloaded with false positives, drones, blinked out of existence, caught in shearing walls or buried under instant avalanches. One Larthan screamed and ran toward what looked like an exit, only to vanish in a sudden slide of ice that sealed behind him like a mouth closing. The others froze. The Eichel twins floated up using their grav boots to try and scan from above, but the ceiling was now a jagged mess of reflective surfaces, vending signals in every direction. Their readings looped back on themselves, forming false maps that told them to go both forward and backward at once. Someone activated a beacon, a sharp, high-frequency ping designed to penetrate dense material and summon orbital rescue. The cavern responded with another groan, and this time the vibration that followed was not a crack, but a shift, a slant to the floor so subtle it could be missed, until you tried to stand still and found your balance sliding. It was then Riley moved. She had stayed silent, watching, listening, noting how the aliens relied on tools that now betrayed them, how none of them looked up or down, or around with their own eyes, only through devices that now showed ghosts and lies. She walked forward slowly, deliberately ignoring the shouted orders to stay put. A Golfar officer reached out to stop her, but the floor buckled between them, and he fell back. Another echo rang out. This one strange, longer than before, not sharp, but low like thunder underwater. Riley turned her head to it. She knew what it meant. There was a deeper space opening nearby, maybe a tunnel, maybe a void, but it was hollow enough to carry sound like that. Behind her, the group fractured again. Some argued for backtracking, others insisted they wait for aerial pickup that would never come in time, while a third group simply ran blindly, following their failed maps and faulty beacons. Every one of them ran the wrong way. Riley kept walking forward, tapping the ice, once with her rod every few steps, counting the delay, listening for the way the sound returned, muffled or sharp, clean or distorted. This was not guessing. This was reading. This was how humans had survived worlds long before they had ships and satellites. And in this moment, with the cavern tearing itself apart, it was the only thing still working. While the others scattered, screamed, and vanished into the chaos of sound and falling crystal, Riley Mace stood in absolute stillness, her boots firm on the ice, her hand resting on her rod, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in focus, in calculation, in something far older than the panic surrounding her. The echo of the last collapse had passed, but its memory hung in the air, like the scent of lightning before a storm, and she could feel it vibrating through her spine, not as sound, but as presence, as pressure, a voice with no words. The alien scientists had come with scanners and algorithms, with drones that hovered and pinged, with eyes that glowed and lenses that processed heat and motion and resonance, but none of their tools could tell them where to go or how to survive, and none of their tech could tell them what she now understood just by standing still and listening. This cavern was no longer a stable formation. It was alive. Alive in the way a dying beast is alive, thrashing in its final moments, reshaping itself with every breath, collapsing and sealing in unpredictable ways, with a will that did not want them there and did not care what species they came from. Riley crouched slowly and placed her gloved hand flat on the surface, closing her eyes, as she had done in caves back on Earth, ones made not of alien ice, but of limestone and basalt, caves where you could not rely on anything except the ground beneath you, the way sound traveled through it, and the rhythm of your own breath. The ice here felt different, but not alien. It pulsed like veins under skin. The cold was so deep it almost felt hot against her suit, and the silence was never total, not really, because there was always some sound, always the distant groaning of shifting pressure or the faintest chime of cracking frost. She took the metal rod from her belt. It was simple steel, not advanced, not clever, just solid and reliable. She tapped it once against the ice. The sound returned quick and flat. Too shallow. She moved 3 steps to the left and tapped again. This time the echo came longer and curved upward, slightly like a breath taken through a flute. She tilted her head and listened to the return, the depth, the width, the change. Someone yelled behind her, calling her name, telling her to regroup, that the lead cartographer had found a new route with triangulation. Riley did not respond. Triangulation meant nothing if the surfaces were changing faster than the readings could stabilize, and she knew the moment they committed to that data, they would be trapped beneath it. She tapped again, this time at an angle, and waited. The sound bounced back deeper, and from 2 directions at once. A fork. One leading nowhere. One still breathing. She stood and turned slowly, marking the angle in her head and taking the first step forward, the first real step toward escape. One of the younger aliens, a tall insectiform creature from the orbital sector, watched her with tilted eyes, then without a word peeled away from the rest and began to follow. Riley tapped again. Echo. Count. Direction. She could feel the route starting to build itself in her mind, like lines drawn in sound on the walls and floor. She did not need a screen. She had the cavern itself talking back to her. and she was the only one listening. The path ahead was narrow and sloped at an angle that made every step feel uncertain, but Riley moved with steady rhythm, tapping her rod gently against the ice, every 5 paces listening for the shift in the echo, the subtle rise and fall that revealed walls' thickness, curves, unseen chambers beyond their view, each sound like a voice telling her where the world still held space and where it did not. The orchil alien behind her clicked softly with each movement, his long limbs awkward in the narrowing passage, but he said nothing, did not question, did not protest, simply watched and followed. And when Riley turned back to glance, he nodded once without fear, without doubt, a gesture that meant he too had begun to hear the map she was drawing. Behind them others hesitated. One of the Golfar twins barked through the comms, warning Riley she was deviating from the pre-approved grid and that her path led toward a known structural weakness. Based on drone data, Riley did not respond, did not slow. She had seen the drone, she had watched them vanish under shifting ice, and she trusted what she heard more than what had failed them. Another echo. She tapped the wall gently, and this time the sound curve left deeper and slower, like breath moving through a throat. She motioned silently and turned. The orchil followed at her side, now not behind, and soon others came. Not all at once, but one by one. A Larthan geochemist from the eastern chamber who had seen his readings scatter into nonsense. A Terran systems officer whose suit antenna had been sheared off by a falling spire, and who now moved with burned gloves and no connection to the network. A pair of Velari twins who floated just above the floor in synchronized motion, their own mapping systems blinking red as they searched for something more solid than data. Together they followed. Together they began to listen. The cavern continued to collapse behind them, the thunder of falling ice chasing their path and sealing every false exit one by one. The map Riley was building was not fixed, not permanent. It was alive and temporary, a string of decisions drawn from vibration and instinct and trust. She would stop only long enough to crouch and listen, not just to echoes, but to the way her breath moved in the air around her, to the change in pressure, to the way frost shifted on her visor. This was not science the way the aliens knew it. This was experience. This was the kind of knowledge that came from being in dangerous places with nothing but your hands and your thoughts. Another fork. The echo came back layered. A high ping and a low one. Riley closed her eyes and separated the sounds in her head, drawing out the direction, the pitch, the decay, and when she opened them again, she knew the way forward. Upward. The others hesitated, but said nothing now. They had begun to feel it. The ice was not just falling, it was guiding them. If they knew how to listen, if they knew how to hear the patterns that repeated in every echo. Riley tapped again, then again. Forward, then left, then down. The tunnel twisted, and the world narrowed around them, but the path held, and the ice held. And for the first time since the collapse began, there was no panic. The tunnel widened just enough for the group to walk two across, though no one dared to speak above a whisper as the ice around them seemed to breathe with every step, echoing even the smallest sound in long haunting waves that faded into the unseen depths beyond each curve. Riley moved at the front, tapping gently every few steps, with a rod in her hand, the rhythm of her movements calming the nerves of those behind her more than any command could. She did not need to look back to know they were still there, still following. Their footsteps had taken on her cadence, their breaths matched the slow pattern of her motion. To them, it was instinct now. She had become something more than a teammate. She had become a signal. A steady, unwavering point in a collapsing world. The Golfar twins finally caught up again, their boots crunching with the precision of soldiers trying to mask uncertainty. Their scanning rigs were offline, but they pretended to check them anyway, the glowing lenses dim and flickering. They opened their mouths to speak, but said nothing when Riley raised her hand. The echo had changed again. She tapped the wall and listened. This one returned like a wave, with a slow fade and a soft rumble beneath it. There was a deeper chamber ahead, and it was wide. She moved forward. Behind her, the others followed without question. Even the more skeptical voices among the crew had quieted their doubts, crushed under the weight of failed tech and vanished exits. Only Riley was leading now, not by rank or protocol, but because nothing else was working. And she was one of the Velari twins floated forward and matched her pace. His voice was soft like mist as he asked how she knew. Riley did not answer immediately. Instead, she tapped again and motioned toward the ground. Then finally she said, "Because the cavern is speaking." And they all heard it then. The low vibration running beneath their boots like the sound of a giant heartbeat, slow and cold. It was not mechanical. It was not artificial. It was ancient, alive in a way only planets and pressure and buried time could be. The ice was guiding them, or warning them, or both. They reached the next chamber just as another roar echoed from far behind. A tunnel sealed off entirely with a sound like a mountain being dragged across metal. Those who had taken the other path, gone, buried. One of the Larthans closed his eyes. A moment of silence passed. Riley tapped the floor again. No echo returned. She turned and tapped the wall. The echo bounced back fast and sharp. "This way," she said. And they moved again. By now, even the aliens with the most advanced navigational training had stopped referencing their broken gear. Instead, they marked the walls with physical etchings following Riley's knife cuts and her sound paths, leaving behind symbols not of any language but of experience. Cuts that meant safe. Cuts that meant dead end. Cuts that meant do not stop. The farther they went, the more the air seemed to warm just slightly, and Riley could feel a change in the density around them. They were getting closer to the surface, not to where they had entered, but to something else, an exit the cavern had not wanted to give. But she had found it, with sound, with instinct, with nothing but the ancient skill of listening. The silence ahead was different, heavier, more still than the rest of the cavern, as if the air itself had stopped breathing. The tunnel narrowed and sloped downwards, slightly before opening into a massive chamber, its size impossible to measure by sight alone, as the walls disappeared into the shimmering white mist that clung to everything like breath on glass. The ice here was smooth and curved unnaturally, so as if something had melted and refrozen it long ago, and Riley felt the shift in the echo before she even tapped the rod. The sound was muted. Not gone, but caught. The ice was thick, too thick. The chamber was wrong. Too quiet. Too still. She tapped again, slower this time, the rod barely grazing the floor, and the sound came back late and soft. Behind her, the group waited. No one moved. No one spoke. Not even the Velari twins who had once hovered with casual grace. Now even they remained still on the ground, because the air told them what Riley already knew. This chamber was a trap, not by design, but by nature. A pocket, a sealed lung in the body of the glacier. One wrong vibration, and it would collapse entirely. Riley stepped forward, her movements feather-light, her boots barely disturbing the frost as she crossed the edge of the space, listening to the creaks that whispered above her head. There was no clear path forward, only the smooth curve of the far wall. But the echo she had heard earlier, the rising one, had come from here. She tapped once more, and there it was again. A hollow note rising just slightly higher than the rest, not from in front of her, but from above. She tilted her head and looked up. At first she saw nothing but the frozen mist and blue-white glimmer of the high ceiling. Then slowly, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. A narrow vertical shaft, almost invisible from below, carved into the ice by time and pressure, or perhaps by the ancient escape of steam rising straight up into the unknown. Riley took a slow breath and turned to the others. "There is no path forward," she said. "Only up." They did not question. They began moving forward one by one, slowly, carefully stepping into the chamber as Riley began testing the ice beneath the shaft, searching for the best place to climb. It would be difficult, narrow, slick, and steep. But it was a way out, and there was no other. The Orchel was the first to assist, pushing his limbs against the side of the shaft, to create anchor points, followed by the Galfar twins who braced against the opposite wall, forming a living framework of support. Riley went last, tapping once more just before she climbed, and hearing a final echo. Short, clean, sharp. The ceiling groaned above them. She felt the rumble before she heard it. Then the sound came, like a wave of thunder crashing into stone. The chamber began to collapse in slow motion at first, then faster, as cracks exploded outward from the far side and sheets of ice peeled away like torn skin. The climbers moved faster now, gripping and pushing and pulling each other upward as shards of crystal rained down behind them. One of the Velari screamed as the platform he stood on disintegrated, and he was caught and pulled upward just in time by Riley and the Orchil, working in perfect silence. They ascended the shaft in a rush of motion and sound while the cavern below died. The moment they pulled the last team member up into the tight winding tunnel above, the chamber gave way completely. A sound like a star collapsing. Then silence. Then stillness again. But they were above it now. Alive. And still moving. The tunnel above the chamber was narrow at first, pressing close around them, with the suffocating silence of untouched places, where no voice had ever echoed, no boot had ever stepped. The ice here was harder, darker, almost ancient, in feel, like the bones of the moon itself had been carved by time into a hidden escape route for those desperate or brave enough to find it. The group climbed with raw urgency, their hands and limbs aching from the vertical ascent, their suits scratched and dented, their minds held together now only by the quiet rhythm of motion and the sound of Riley Mace at the front tapping the rod with every new length of tunnel, measuring space by ear alone, her breath steady, her eyes fixed ahead, as though she could already see the light beyond the walls. They'd moved in shifts, those with strength holding and anchoring, those with less stability assisting one another wordlessly, as the gravity of what had just happened still sat heavy in their chests. The chamber below them gone, sealed forever by the final collapse. No one needed to speak of those who had chosen different paths, who had trusted the machines instead of the human ear. No one dared. The shaft twisted, then sloped, the angle softening until the climb became a crawl, then a shuffle, then a slow march forward, and up toward something fresher in the air, something lighter. Riley could feel it first, before anyone else, the way the pressure lifted just slightly with each breath, the way the echoes now came faster and cleaner. They were nearing the surface. The final wall came without warning, a sheet of brittle ice only inches thick, a last barrier between them and open air and sunlight. Riley placed her hand against it and listened to the echo return from the other side. Open sky. She motioned for the Velari to assist, and together they placed a charge just small enough to fracture the ice without bringing the whole passage down. The blast was a muffled thud. And then light. Blinding white light. The kind that sears through a visor and paints the world in reflections of fire and snow. They climbed out one by one into the frozen daylight of Thraxis, its twin suns low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the glacial field, the wind sharp, but familiar, a normal wind, not the whispering breath of a dying cavern. They stood there at the edge of the ice shelf, silent as the tunnel behind them cracked and sealed with one last groan, the glacier reclaiming its secret, as though it had never been there at all. The Orchil sat in the snow, legs folded, breathing deep with steam curling from his vents. The Galfar twins scanned the horizon with exhausted eyes, while the Velari simply stood still, glowing faintly in the cold. And Riley stood alone at the ridge, looking back toward the place where the mountain had swallowed the others. Not speaking, not moving, just listening. The wind carried no echoes now. Just the sound of survival. The alien commander approached slowly, his uniform torn in places, his breathing shallow, but his posture upright. He stopped beside her and held out a small metal object etched with the sigil of the expedition unit, a mark of leadership, recognition, honor. Riley did not speak as she took it. She turned it over in her gloved hand once, then slid it into a pocket without ceremony, her eyes already scanning the terrain ahead. Because there was still more ground to cover. Still more unknowns. Still more paths to find. The others gathered around her now, not out of obligation or rank, but out of instinct, because she had led them, not with tech or authority, but with something more elemental. She had led them by hearing what no machine could, by reading what no map could draw, by trusting a part of herself no algorithm would ever understand. They waited for her to speak. She said nothing, only tapped the rod once on the frozen ground. A soft, clear echo returned. They began to walk.